A viewer of one of my videos on the wireless transmission of power recently asked the question, could a device like Tesla's tower be built and made to run as intended without it having a global effect? I'm curious if this system makes the entire planet available for free energy by nature, or if it would be possible to limit the coverage to a local radius around said device. Okay, this is a great question, and it inspired me to do an off-the-cuff, impromptu response. The answer to this question is no. Tesla's system was meant to work on a global scale, and the reason will become apparent when you understand what the frequency distributions look like and how he meant to use them. Tesla intended for waves from his system to go from one side of the earth and back, just like the echo off of a wall. If you shout at a wall, the sound wave bounces off the wall and comes back to you. That's the echo that you hear. And if you do it at exactly the right frequency tuning, they'll actually reinforce one another. It's called constructive reinforcement, and it works in most resonance systems. So if we look at Tesla's system, let's say we start out with one tower in a reflective environment. If we start off with one tower in a reflective environment, this is a basic simulation. The simulation is greatly slowed down. It's actually a lot slower than the actual effect would happen, because the actual effect is happening at conduction velocities at some percentage of the speed of light through the skin of the Earth. You'll notice that the signal goes out and comes back. One tower putting out a relatively low frequency, the signal goes out and comes back. Now, as the frequency changes, you'll notice that the signal goes out and comes back and self-reinforces. This is a phenomenon called constructive reinforcement. So the waves go out and come back and build one another as they do so. And now you'll have to imagine the three-dimensional spherical case on this very simple two-dimensional slice of a system. But the one thing you immediately notice is that as the frequency gets higher, the signal spreads out, the signal dissipates, the signal becomes lost in the oscillations, and no matter how much it reinforces, it never quite retains the original strength with which it was sent. Now, even in a system like the Earth, where the energy would be conserved, there would still be sufficient damping to make the signal spread out like this, especially at higher frequency ranges. And at those higher frequency ranges, the signal would only really be good for transmitting information, which I think was the purpose of the original Wardenclyffe Tesla Tower, which was to demonstrate the viability of the system as an information transmission device. Because if he had only one other system, which was just tuned to receive, anywhere else on the planet he would be able to send a signal, and that signal wouldn't require any of the things that we are accustomed to expecting from a normal antenna system, which would be line of sight, or reflecting off of the atmosphere. Any of the things that we are normally limited by in the transmission of information via radio signals. I mean, look at the complexity of the frequency dynamics you're getting from just one tower. And all of those frequencies could be bounced from one side of the Earth to the other and back, meaning that you would have basically a hive of transmission inside the Earth. All of the signals going at once from every place on the Earth, back and forth to one another without the restriction of line of sight. This is incredibly revolutionary, and it would put in the hands of the average person the ability to contact anyone else, anywhere else on the planet, and communicate with them freely and without the restrictions imposed upon us by the people who control the air. In other words, the governments that are responsible for controlling the airspace, the FCC or whatever organization it is in your country that controls the content of transmitted signals. Well, how do you control signals that are transmitted from the direct other side of the Earth? You don't. And that's one of the reasons why the system has been restricted, because the freedom it engenders is not something that the people who wish to retain control want you to have. They don't want you to have that freedom. So they'd rather the system transmit through satellites, which they can control, or through radio towers, which have a limited range. Now, let's change this up, and let's look at what if it was 4 towers. Now, as you get 4 towers going, you can automatically notice right off the bat that you have nodes and antinodes forming. And these are huge nodes and antinodes if we're talking about the system the size of the Earth. So at a higher frequency, which is a little closer to what you'd probably be getting from the Tesla tower system with 4 towers, you will notice right off the bat that you start seeing conductive channels forming with a beat that is a much lower frequency than the input frequency. The frequency the towers are actually broadcasting is much higher than this, but because of constructive reinforcement, there are actually conductive channels at a much lower beat forming between the stations and even in between them inside what would be the Earth in this 2-dimensional example. And this is non-reflective. The energy is not even being conserved. It's simply showing you what the reinforcement does with the frequencies just as they are bleeding out. So even if there was no reflection, even if the energy was not conserved inside the skin of the Earth, these signals would still be reinforcing to a degree that you might be able to collect meaningful amounts of industrial electricity from. Now imagine if the energy was conserved in this system. If these signals were still forming in the frequency beats that they're forming right now and in the conduction channels that they're forming right now, but the energy's conserved. It would be an unimaginable amount of energy just storing up in the planet in a resonant function, bouncing back and forth between these things, like a pendulum being batted from one source of oscillation to another. The amount of energy that you could conserve with a set of 4 stations like this, it's not like anything humanity has ever even conceived of before. And because it's spread out, it wouldn't do any damage to the actual crust of the Earth itself, but it still would give us a electric and magnetic field which would be harvestable with a properly tuned device. So even if we look at 2 towers, now that's not frozen. That's actually just what's happening with the frequencies themselves interacting between 2 stations. And you'll notice a very high frequency signal is actually giving you an incredibly low frequency beat going between the 2 stations. Now imagine if this, with all of that radiation coming out the sides, if this was actually in a closed spherical system. Now let's turn that frequency up any more, and guess what you get? In between the 2 nodes, in between the 2 broadcasting towers, you get a beat. And that beat represents the movement of current between those 2 towers. A movement of current so significant that it might allow us to transmit usable industrial amounts of electricity between these stations and store it in the oscillating function in the telluric current channels. So here's some fun other color examples of what this would look like. And I'm going to play with the frequencies a little bit just so that you can see the difference. This is 4 stations again, and I'm going to turn up the damping a little bit. I'm going to turn up the resistance to the transitive current. You'll notice that it didn't really do much damage, even though I turned it up a little bit. Now, let's crank up the frequency again, and there we go again. You see it, the conductive channels and the nodes forming. There's resonance even in this square 2-dimensional slice. Imagine what this signal would look like if going across a 3-dimensional spherical structure with oddly shaped conductive channels. If you tune it even more precisely, and this is an incredibly imprecise tuning with this simulation, if you tune it up, you'll notice you always get conduction channels. The signals reinforce one another and they create a beat. And that beat would create a magnetic field which would be just as harvestable as the one that I showed you on the power lines with the electromagnetic field detector in my other video on the wireless transmission of electricity. So I hope that helped. I hope that answered the question. Please remember, energy is free.